Well, hello there. Welcome to part 2 of our watercolor tips and techniques. Today we're just going to talk about the finish up of the techniques that we learned before, and we're going to talk about applying a few of these techniques and tips to a little sample landscape section, which you guys are going to be doing one of these to practice experimenting with some of these little tips. So one thing I wanted to real quick show you guys that we didn't quite get to finish from our last little video was the last step with our resist method using our white colored pencil. So we applied that down, we did the watercolor over it, and now what we're going to do is come in, and if you look at this as an angle, you can see where the colored pencil is located. And if I erase over this, it's going to make the color, the pigment that's sitting on top of that colored pencil, come off. And you can see that it leaves a really cool little effect that you could, and it's subtle, so you could use this for something like waves or something like the top crest for an ocean or something like that. You can also see that even though I took this up a touch early, you can see the way that where the saran wrap was touching, the connection points made a lighter value, and then the areas where that pigment was kind of allowed to just sit there, we got a more concentrated dark coloration. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk to you guys about using a couple of these techniques to do a little sample landscape, and this is going to be your first experimental assignment with your watercolor. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to first suggest that you obviously draw out a landscape. So draw out some little practice tree. In this situation is what we're going to be doing. The first one, this is not your official landscape that you're handing in for a grade. This is the summative, this is not the summative, this is the formative work. So this is practicing and experimenting. And so I'd like all of you to do some practicing and experimenting. And so what I'm going to have you do first is just sketch out something on a piece of half sheet of that watercolor paper that you have. If you guys are running out of paper, I do have more paper placed in the blue bin at school, and it is ready for you to pick up. So you can go and get some more watercolor paper out of the blue bin. It's on the ceramic patio right outside if you go past door 3 and walk down that area, you will kind of run into it as you walk, okay? And I'll put the directions of where that's located more thoroughly in your assignment for today. So I've come in with a pencil and done a very light drawing. Keeping in mind, anywhere where I see pencil lead, I'm going to see that pencil when I'm finished. Watercolor is translucent, so you can see through it. You will be seeing some of that pencil as you go. So make sure that if it bothers you and you don't want that pencil to show, that you draw as light as you can. The other thing that you could use to help you with that and make the pencil show up a little bit less would be to use something called a watercolor pencil to do your sketching. So let's say that you drew something out and I'm using this kind of red color. You could sketch it out with a watercolor pencil, and when you wet these, it actually will dissolve and the pencil will fade. So it's going to almost not be visible when I'm done. So you can see that that's starting to not completely 100% go away. This is a slightly cheaper brand of pencil, but it is getting much lighter so that you will not see it. And especially if I had any actual color in this, it would mix with it. And you can see how it's kind of dissolving and fading, okay? Watercolor pencils are actually used and designed to be used with watercolor traditional paint. So you could certainly do that if you have a set of these. If you don't, they're not a necessity, but it's cool if you have it. You could play with it. So I'm going to come in first with my light pencil drawing, and I'm going to start adding some color onto items into my little samples here that I'm going to play with. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys about some of the techniques that we learned in the last video, and I'm going to apply some of these to sections of this little guy, okay? Notice that before I start doing anything with the trees, I came in and did a light wash on the sky. Okay, the reason I did the light wash, and notice it's not a really dark blue, it's very faded, is because when I'm doing things on my tree, if there are gaps, I want little bits of blue to show through so that it looks like kind of I'm looking at a tree, you know, with the sky behind it. So I want to keep that effect happening. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to place some watercolor down. I'm using a wet to dry method on my very light tree that I just quickly sketched out. Now, when you're doing watercolor, it's important to know your light source. So my light is coming from this side. And because I have my light on that side, there are two things that I'm going to need to think about and consider as I work. Number one is going to be, hey, I need to have a lighter value on the side where the light hits it. Just like when you did your still life work with the chalks and with the oil pastel, and just like you did when you did your charcoal drawings, you had to think about the direction of the light. So this is kind of my mid-range color. And if I know that I want my highlight or my light source to be coming from the right, then that means I'm going to have to do two things. I'm going to have to add darker brown or a darker value on the opposite side. And I'm going to have a lighter value on the right side. I'm adding a few more brown areas for little mini branches coming through here. So to make my side of my tree darker, what I can do is simply come in if I wanted to and do another layer of the same brown. And after that first side dries a little, you can see that just by adding another layer of that same color, it creates a deeper, darker brown. Another thing that I could do, however, is come in and make a darker color, a shadow color, and I'm going to do it by mixing together some dark blue with some brown. That's going to give me a nice dark, dark brown. You could even come in if you wanted to and use just dark blue in your shadows. And if I don't think that my bark is blending enough, if I think that that's too strong, I can come in with a slightly damp brush and just re-wet that so that it blends just a little bit into that brown that's under it. Now let's say that I wanted to come in, I'll show you that just plain blue also so you can see what that would look like. Remember that when you're using anything that is orange based, like the browns that we're using has an orange base, that it is the complement of blue. So when you're doing a lot of mixing of complements, they're going to kind of neutralize each other and they're going to give you kind of sometimes not the most beautiful colors. You kind of have to know how to play with them to make them work together. They're going to be very neutral based. So in the gray or kind of olive greeny range. And then let's say that I wanted to come in now and do my highlight on this side. I've let this firm up a little bit, and the reason that I let that kind of sit for a minute before I did my highlight is because I wanted it to soak into the page just a touch. Now I'm going to come in with my brush, just slightly wet, and I can re-wet this side. And I can create a highlight. simply by removing some of that color. A couple of other things that I told you guys you could use in addition to just a brush. And if it seems to be not wanting to come off at first, put the water, just a little touch of water down. Just gently rub it and then dry off the brush and it will pull it out just like that. Just to show you that highlight removal. The other thing I mentioned to you guys that you could use for creating highlights, I told you guys that you could come in and use things like cotton swabs. And so I could certainly come in, if I chose to, and use a cotton swab. I also could come in and I could put some highlights down first if I wanted to, with a lighter color, like a white colored pencil or something like that, to lighten those areas if I chose to. So that's kind of how you would get your basic highlight and shadow started. Okay, now this guy is obviously not finished. I'm not gonna belabor the point of this. A lot of this is I want you experimenting. And you've already watched me do a lot of these techniques already, so I don't want you to get bored. Highlight on that side. I'm going to show you a couple things you can do for the tree itself, for the greenery of the tree, or if we wanted to do fall colors, you could do that. I'm going to come in and make some variations of green. So I'm going to mix in some yellows into that green. What I don't want you guys to do is to use just straight colors from the pan. I do want you to do some mixing. So even if you're using this as your starting point green in a few areas, I also want you mixing. We spent a lot of time learning how to mix the colors for our color theory chart. So this is just mixing some yellow into the base green. And now what I'm going to do is take some yellow and mix into my blue that I have right beside of this to create a more mixed green, and you can see that they get different results. So I have several different greens to work with. So I'm going to come in and start applying a little bit of this green. Now we can come in with this and apply it on a dry surface. If I wet this first and then put this green down, it would give me a more faded look, which some people really love, that watery look. This is my other green. That's just the yellow and green from the pan. You can see the difference in the greens. Put a little touch more water in here. You do want the colors to maintain a little bit of their own integrity. And what I mean by that is, you don't want to have, if you're using several different greens, for example, you don't want them to completely merge. You want to be able to see each of the greens. There's a really cool technique I'm going to show you guys in just a second. That's another way that you can create some tree type stuff that I'll show you down here. But I want to show you after this firms up. So I've got my kind of yellowish green started. Now I'm going to make some darker greens that are going to be my shadow greens. When light hits trees, it also creates highlight and shadow. So when you're putting your colors down, you're not going to have just one green. You're going to have several. So I can take a brush with a little bit of my color on it. And I'm going to show you kind of down here. You can kind of just roll that like this. And it's going to give it a little bit freer organic edge. And let that color kind of pool in certain areas. And I'll do it down here as well to show you. You can kind of roll it. And as the color thins down on your brush, you're going to get more broken texture application, which can look really cool for like shadow areas in a tree, which I'm going to show you up here. I was waiting for that to dry a little bit. So I'm going to teach you how you can take that and just kind of roll in a little bit of shadow color in your tree. So the light is hitting from this side, so I need a lot of light here. I want to have more darker stuff on the side. This part's really wet, so I'm not going to touch it at the moment. And if you feel like, uh-oh, that's too wet, what am I going to do? I've ruined it. Don't panic. Simply take a paper towel, tap your brush, and then re-roll it into the color. And that brings up the importance of paper towels in our work. Paper towels can be used for many things. I'm going to let that part firm up for just a second. They can be used for creating things like clouds, and we're going to do a little bit of that in just a second. But before I jump away from the trees, the last thing I want to mention to you is our old buddy, the sponge, can also be used in trees. In addition to just rolling the brush and doing kind of some of the stuff that I just showed you, I can come in. I'm going to mix a little bit of brown and green together to create a new color. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to take my slightly damp sponge and I'm going to put the color with the brush on the sponge like this. And if I barely tap it, you can see that it will also give you some really cool kind of textured effects that can make it look more tree-like. Okay, so I hope that's giving you guys some tips for how to start thinking about trees. So let's think a little bit about how to use our paper towel and our cotton swab to do some other effects. So in our demo that we already did, we learned about using the brush to do removal to create highlights. I want to show you using the cotton swab a little bit more. So I'm going to come in and we're going to pretend that these are mountains back here. So I'm creating kind of a bluish gray. I took some blue and mixed some brown into it to make this kind of steel gray color. And I'm going to come in if this is my side of a mountain, maybe. Put a touch more water up here. Keeping in mind what we said about landscapes, okay? We said that landscapes, that things that are in the foreground are going to look darker and more intense, that things that are further away tend to have more faded color. So maybe the mountain that is behind this first mountain, if I want it to really look like it's going back in space, I'll make that a lighter value. I can borrow some of this color to put over here. So I've got a base color and it looks really super flat. So how do we come in and create some highlight on one side and create some kind of effects of light? Well, I can come in with a cotton swab, and if I rub certain areas of my mountain, I can create some texture effects and lighter areas. So I'm going to re-wet that, and then I'm going to take my cotton swab and by using a cotton swab that already had a little color on it, you see that I can create little divots of darks and little divots of light. So it's an interesting, cool little texture that you can play with. So we've got our highlights starting over here. I could come in now and put in a little bit of darker area kind of around that to really emphasize maybe the jagged edge of the rocks. Maybe the light is hitting that side. And then maybe I'm going to come in and mix in a little bit of another color in with this. Think about your color palettes. Think about analogous color. Think about complementary colors. Leave a little bit of that texture. And it's going to create kind of that cool jagged effect. And then let's say that I don't like this edge right here. Maybe I think this is too harsh. I can soften that with my brush. And take some of that off. And fade that if I wanted to. So you can work that surface and experiment with any of those that you choose to. So let's say that I wanted to do something like maybe have clouds that are happening in the sky. I can come in again with my wet brush. I've already got a light grayish blue that's happening here. So I'm wetting a shape here for my cloud structure. And then I'm going to take a clean napkin or paper towel. And I'm going to come in after I've wet that, and I'm going to blot off gradually small amounts of the color. And now because you guys are far away from this, you might not be able to see. I should have made this guy a little darker so you could see it. Gradually, I'm pulling up some of that color. And I think if you look at it here, you can see that that's gradually lightening that area. It's creating a lighter highlight effect. Now, really expensive, nice watercolor paper, if you wet it with your brush and do a little bit of this rubbing, it's not going to hurt much. But we are using economy watercolor paper. So don't be surprised if you notice, if you do this process, that you start to get a little bit of paper pulp that shows up. Don't panic. You can just rub it off later. So I've lightened that a little bit, and now I can come in and gray up the base. So if this is the bottom of that cloud area, I can add a little bit of pigment and create like a cast shadow under the bottom of the cloud. Alternately, I could change my sky color, so I could come in and add more coloration. I'll do a touch of that for you guys. So I could come in around the cloud, and this is a really not great blue, but kind of go around that cloud structure that we started. And I'm going to fade this so that it looks soft. And don't panic, you guys. If you're, the whole point of experimenting with this is to enjoy the process of learning something different and new. You can see that that's kind of creating a soft edge, and I could fade that more if I wanted to, add more clouds into it. And then the last thing I want to show you is the grass effect that I mentioned to you guys in the last video. If you're doing something like grasses, we talked about the scoring technique. You can do it before, or you can do it after you wet the paper. I'm going to do part of each, and then I'll put some color down on it, and you can see what happens in both sections. You can see even without the color, you can see this more. And then let's do like a faded kind of greenish gray to finish this up. And it will kind of stick to those scored areas and show up as grass. This section we know is going to be more subtle because I told you guys that that's what happens. But you can still see those slight scorings that happened. So it's darker if you wet the paper first. If you want something very, very subtle, then do it, score it, and then wet the paper. And so that gives you a few ways to think about experimenting using several of these little steps and these processes that I mentioned to you guys before. And so as you're reading through your assignment today, your experimentation assignment, I want you to choose at least have a tree involved in it somewhere, and then you could do water, you could have grasses, but I want you experimenting with some of these experimental processes. Okay? Have a great fun time and don't panic. Okay? Just enjoy the process.